From the rear of the aircraft, Greg Mortensen reached his long arm out to tap Bangu on the shoulder of his flight suit. "General, sir," Mortensen shouted, "I think we're heading the wrong way." Brigadier Bangu had been President Musharraf's personal pilot before retiring from the military to join a civilian aviation company. He was in his late 60s, with salt and pepper hair and a mustache as clipped and cultivated as the vowels he'd inherited from the private British colonial school he'd attended as a boy with Musharraf and many of Pakistan's other future leaders. The general tossed his cigarette through the vent and blew out his breath. Then he bent to compare the store-bought GPS unit he balanced on his knee with a military-grade map Mortensen folded to highlight what he thought was our position. "I've been flying in northern Pakistan for 40 years, he said, waggling his head, the subcontinent's most distinctive gesture. "How is it you know the terrain better than me?" Bangu banked the Alouette steeply to port, flying back the way we'd come. The red light that had worried me before began to flash faster. The bobbing needle on the gauge showed that we had less than 100 liters of fuel. This part of northern Pakistan was so remote and inhospitable that we'd had to have friends pre-position barrels of aviation fuel at strategic sites by jeep. If we couldn't make it to our drop zone, we were in a tight spot, literally, since the craggy canyon we flew through had no level areas suitable for setting the Alouette down. Bangu climbed high, so he'd have the option of auto-rotating toward a more distant landing zone if we ran out of fuel, and jammed his stick forward, speeding up to 90 knots. Just as the needle hit E and the red warning light began to beep, Bangu set the skids at the center of a large H for helipad written out in white rocks next to our barrels of jet fuel. "That was a lovely sortie," Bangu said, lighting another cigarette. "But it might not have been without Mr. Mortensen." Later, after refueling by inserting a hand pump into a rusting barrel of aviation fuel, we flew up the Braldu Valley to the village of Corfe, the last human habitation before the Balturo Glacier begins its march up to K2 and the world's greatest concentration of 20,000-foot-plus peaks. After a failed 1993 attempt to climb K2, Mortensen arrived in Corfe, emaciated and exhausted. In this impoverished community of mud and stone huts, both Mortensen's life and the lives of northern Pakistan's children changed course. One evening he went to bed by a yak dung fire, a mountaineer who'd lost his way. And one morning, by the time he'd shared a pot of butter tea with his hosts and laced up his boots, he'd become a humanitarian who'd found a meaningful path to follow for the rest of his life.